Today we're going to go through the best settings for the MSI MPG 322UR X24. This is their latest 32-inch QD-OLED monitor, 4K resolution, 240Hz refresh rate, using a 4th gen pentatandem QD-OLED panel. We'll set the screen up for both SDR and HDR usage, as well as look at other things like OLED care and gaming settings. And you can use these settings from a PC or equally from a console or any other device. They should serve you well across all of those different use cases. We've reset the screen to factory defaults here, and we're going to start by having a look at the SDR configuration. So you can see that HDR is off. We're going to start in the preset mode menu, and we're going to move out of the eco mode, and we're going to use the user mode. So this will give us full access to all of the settings. And by default, it operates with the full native wide gamut of the panel. We'll talk about ways that you might want to work with sRGB and SDR content in another way shortly. But for now, we're going to set the screen up with the wide gamut mode. So brightness, we're going to set down to a setting of 27 if you want to return yourself a luminance of 120 nits, but you can set this at whatever you find comfortable and appropriate for your usage and your ambient light conditions. 27 is just a number that will get you to 120 nits if you're targeting that, but like I say, set this at whatever you find comfortable and appropriate. Contrast can stay on 70, the default, that's fine. Sharpness and image enhancement we're going to leave on defaults as well. Color temperature, we're going to move out of the 6500K mode. That's already very good, but we can make a couple of minor tweaks to the RGB balance, which just correct the white point ever so slightly. So we're going to set red at 97, green at 99, and we'll leave blue on 100. And we found that just gave us a slightly better white point of a little bit closer to 6500K. So we're going to use that as our customized configuration. The low blue light mode, you probably want to leave this turned off, but you may want to use it perhaps in the evening or for lots of text work. You can enable that, turn that on and off here if you want, but we'd recommend leaving it off for an accurate white point that we're trying to target here. Everything else for saturation, 6-axis color, they can stay on defaults. Gamma, leave that on the default 2.2 unless you specifically want to work with another gamma configuration of some sort. So that user mode operates with the full native color space of the panel. There's no way to clamp that within the user mode. You can't change the color space setting. But if you want to, you could try out our calibrated ICC profile that's linked in the description below, which will clamp that wide color space back to sRGB for use in color aware applications. So that's potentially a good way of giving you the best of both worlds. You can have wide gamut content when you want it, sRGB for relevant sRGB content. If you decide that you want to work with sRGB all the time and you want to clamp the very saturated and vivid colors of the native gamut, then MSI do also provide 3 emulation modes in the menu. You've got one here for sRGB, you've also got one for Adobe RGB, which is useful sometimes for photography applications, and Display P3, which is potentially useful for some HDR applications and HDR content creation. We think the other mode that some people might want to use is sRGB. Now you will notice that the colors look far less vivid and saturated in this mode, and that's deliberate, but this is more accurate for working with SDR content and sRGB content. You do lose access to some of the settings in this mode. You'll see that contrast is now unavailable, but you still retain access to gamma if you want to change that. Color temperature, you've lost access to the customized settings, so we're going to leave that on 6500K. That's pretty accurate here anyway. And then you can just adjust brightness to whatever you find comfortable for your usage conditions. Again, a setting of 27 would give you a luminance of around 120 nits if you wanted to target that. But like I say, you don't have to by all means. So you can use the sRGB mode if you want. Don't use our calibrated ICC profile if you're going to use the sRGB mode. That's only designed to be used with the user mode, the full native gamut version. So you can choose depending on what you want to do there. We'll leave it set on the user mode for now. In the rest of the menu, you've got this gaming section at the top. You can enable any of these settings that you might want here. AI vision, that acts like a black stabilizer adjustment, adjusting very dark shades and very dark content. That might be useful for some darker gaming situations. We found the black shadow detail actually to be good on this model anyway with this off, so you may not need it. But if you're playing a lot of darker games or watching a lot of darker movies, you can bump this up to one of the other settings if you want to. Experiment with that and see which ones you like. You can turn on the AI care sensor here, so that's the motion sensor built into the bottom of the screen, which will turn the screen off when you move away from it, turn it back on when you come back. You can set that to be controlled by Windows system mode or monitor mode, and then configure the other relevant settings. Refer to the user manual if you want to know about how that works a little bit more, but that might be useful to enable here as well. Linked to that is the AI brightness control, which will activate the ambient light sensor. You can turn that on as well, and you can customize, like the level of brightness it will operate at here, and it will control it around whatever you set here. So again, if you set that to 27, for instance, it will adjust that depending on your ambient light conditions. So that's quite a useful feature to enable. So you can activate that here and then set your kind of default brightness level as well. In the gaming menu, there's a couple of other things that you could control here, some other gaming settings. The SDR brightness mode, this is set to uniform by default, so that will give you a uniform luminance regardless of your content and your window sizes. I think that's going to be preferable for most people for desktop and general usage. But if you want a bit of a brightness boost for perhaps SDR gaming and multimedia, you can switch this to the dynamic mode, which will give you a boosted luminance, but you will have to live with some ABL dimming. That's probably going to be less noticeable anyway in those kind of dynamic uses. So it's certainly a viable option to choose for SDR gaming and movies and things if you want. We're going to leave that on uniform now for just kind of general desktop applications. Corner uniformity, leave that on the default level 4. Not really sure why this option has been introduced, but the other modes just seem to dim the edges and corners of the screen, which is really not ideal. So leave it on level 4 for the optimum panel luminance uniformity. No need to turn DSC off, but you can do here if you want to, if you've got a UHBR20 graphics card, but there's very little need to. It's available there if you need. Adaptive sync, you can leave that turned on for VRR, and then there's a few other gaming settings that you might want to experiment with there. In the OLED care menu, you want to leave as many of these turned on as you can to mitigate the risk of image retention. You can turn some of them off if you find them distracting or they're causing problems or kind of noticeable dimming and that kind of thing. They should all be turned on by default anyway, but you can change some of the things like the reducing level if you want to make them more or less aggressive in what they do. Like I say, turn as many of those on as possible or leave them turned on, and just turn off any that you find problematic. They should all be generally pretty useful and good though. In this extra menu, there's only really a couple of things you might want to have a look at. You can turn the power LED off here if you want, the RGB lighting on the back of the screen, and the HDMI CEC option is probably useful to turn on. That will auto switch over to the HDMI input when it detects a device has been powered on. So if you've got a games console or something connected via HDMI as well as your PC via DisplayPort, then when you power the console on, it will just auto switch to that input. So that's quite useful to have. You can also set a couple of shortcuts here with the Navi key if you want quick access to, I don't know, brightness or the picture-in-picture, picture-by-picture settings, for instance. You can configure those to your liking there. So we've enabled HDR mode now from Windows, and you can see the screen has switched over to the HDR mode here. As a reminder, we'd recommend only enabling Windows HDR when you're going to view actual HDR content. There's loads of reasons for that. They're all explained in our video that's linked in the description below, so check that out if you want to know more about it. In HDR mode, you'll see that quite a few of the settings are now unavailable, but the new one that is now opened up is this one for Display HDR. You can see there's a few modes to choose from here. There's True Black 500, Peak 1000 nits, EOTF boost, and then there's a couple of customization options which allow you to tweak the True Black 500 or Peak 1000 modes if you want to. But we think most people will probably want to use the EOTF boost mode, which we found offered the best balance between accuracy and brightness, landing somewhere in between the True Black 500 and Peak 1000 in terms of overall brightness, but giving you access to the full peak brightness capability in low APL scenes. So we think that's probably the best balance here. HDR brightness, leave that on 100 unless you have a specific reason to turn that down. And then everything else can pretty much stay as it was. We're using the user mode, but you'll see that most of the other settings are now unavailable anyway. So that's really all there is to configure for HDR. Just as a reminder, EOTF boost mode is probably best, and then HDR brightness. You can experiment with the other modes. So I think you'll find that Peak 1000 nits is much darker than intended. True Black 500 can be a bit brighter in certain circumstances, but it doesn't reach the 1000 nits peak brightness. So there's a bit of a trade-off there, and we think most people will be happy with EOTF boost mode. So there you go, there's the screen set up for both SDR and HDR. Do give us a quick like below if you found this video useful and helpful, and you'll find a link to our calibrated ICC profile in the description below as well. Thank you for watching. We'll catch you next time.